What does it mean when a princess born into one of the richest dynasties of Europe dies at just 23, not in battle, not by poison, but convulsing on the floor like a forgotten patient? How can someone surrounded by gold and servants, by tutors and courtiers, end her life in a spectacle of spasms, foam at her lips, and a terror in her eyes that no crown could protect her from? The final hours of Princess Catherine Renata of Austria did not resemble the serene passing of a royal figure. Instead, her body betrayed her in front of the very walls that had once promised safety. In the silence of a candle-lit chamber, attendants watched as her limbs jerked violently. Her breathing broke into gasps, and her face contorted in anguish. No physician could intervene. No priest could soften what unfolded. The marble pillars and painted ceilings of her palace only heightened the cruelty of the scene, for they framed her death with cold indifference. She was not killed by a blade or by intrigue. Her killer came from within, as if her very blood carried a secret curse. The House of Habsburg, renowned for its power and feared for its rigid obsession with purity of blood, left its heirs not only crowns and lands, but also fragile bodies shaped by generations of close kinship. Catherine's seizures were more than a medical condition. To those who whispered in the shadows of the court, they were signs of something darker, a family paying the price for the sins of its own lineage. So the question remains, was Catherine Renata simply a young woman struck down by an illness medicine could not yet name? Or was her death another chapter in the silent tragedy of Habsburg blood? Stay with this story until the end, because what claimed her life may reveal the hidden curse of an empire. And if you want to follow every shadowed corner of royal history, subscribe now to the Torture Throne. The House of Habsburg was not just a dynasty. It was an experiment in power sustained by blood itself. For centuries, the rulers of Austria, Spain, and beyond believed that strength did not come from alliances alone, but from sealing family lines in marriage after marriage. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and generation after generation carried the same names, the same crowns, and the same genes. This pursuit of purity, intended to keep thrones safe from outsiders, became a kind of silent gamble. The price would only be revealed in the fragile bodies of those who bore the family name. It was into this gilded and precarious world that Princess Catherine Renata of Austria was born in 1576. She was the daughter of Charles II, Archduke of Inner Austria, and Maria Anna of Bavaria. From the moment of her birth, she represented the union of two powerful branches of Catholic Europe, yet also the merging of bloodlines already entangled. For the court, her arrival was a blessing, another symbol of continuity. For history, it would become another example of how a family's obsession with controlling destiny could sow the seeds of its own undoing. As a child, Catherine's life seemed bathed in luxury. Her days unfolded inside the Renaissance palaces of Grasse, where tapestries hung from high stone walls and courtiers attended her every need. Tutors whispered Latin verses and prayers into her ears, and her mother, a devout Catholic, ensured she was raised in strict piety. On feast days, Catherine was dressed in gowns of velvet, her small hands decorated with rings meant to symbolize the greatness of her lineage. Yet beneath this surface of splendor, there was fragility. Records note her health was never strong, that her childhood was punctuated by periods of weakness that seemed to sap the glow from her young face. The Habsburgs, who believed so fiercely in their divine mission, rarely admitted vulnerability. To speak of illness in a child of such standing was to risk inviting rumors, to risk suggesting that the hand of God did not favor their dynasty. But whispers could not be silenced forever. Servants noticed when Catherine missed public appearances. Courtiers traded glances when she appeared pale, her frame thinner than expected. To the outside world, she was still a princess, but within the palace corridors, the signs of a body marked by hidden strain began to show. What made her condition more haunting was the way the dynasty itself seemed to feed it, in their obsession with keeping crowns within the family. The Habsburgs ignored the dangers of repeated consanguinity. Modern science would later confirm what courtiers could only sense, that inbreeding narrowed the genetic pool, increasing the risk of disorders, seizures, and early death. In Catherine's time, however, such knowledge did not exist. Instead, illness was seen through the lens of morality or fate. A sickly princess was not a victim of genetic collapse, but a symbol of divine testing, or, more ominously, of a curse placed upon the family. For Catherine, childhood became a balancing act between privilege and fragility. She could walk through gardens where fountains sparkled and musicians played, but she also knew the weight of being observed for signs of weakness. Every cough, every fainting spell, carried meaning in a court where appearances mattered as much as survival. If she smiled during ceremonies, it was not just the smile of a child, but of a dynasty needing to prove its vigor. If she stumbled, it was more than clumsiness. It was a reminder of the risks hidden in Habsburg blood. As she grew, the contrast between her surroundings and her inner battles sharpened. The marble halls echoed with choirs and banquets, yet Catherine's world was increasingly shaped by the quiet monitoring of her health. Physicians, limited in their knowledge, prescribed diets, prayers, and remedies that did little more than delay the inevitable. For her parents, deeply religious and politically cautious, this fragility could never be fully spoken of. To admit it was to acknowledge the cracks forming in a dynasty that had built its power on the illusion of permanence. This tension between splendor and weakness followed her from the cradle. Catherine Renata was more than a child of privilege. She was the embodiment of a dynasty's contradictions. Her very existence carried both the promise of continuity and the shadow of decline. As her youth unfolded, the palace walls could not hide the truth forever. The fragility noticed in her early years would not fade with time. Instead, it would grow into something far more visible, something that neither crowns nor prayers could disguise. The first signs of Catherine Renata's illness did not emerge in the privacy of her chamber, but under the gaze of an entire court. During a banquet held to celebrate a feast day, when music filled the hall and goblets of wine glittered in the torchlight, her body betrayed her. She was seated among nobles, dressed in embroidered silk, her face illuminated by the glow of candles, when suddenly her hand stiffened against the table. Witnesses later wrote of how her head tilted violently, her eyes rolled upward, and her lips trembled before her entire body was seized by uncontrollable spasms. The room, once alive with laughter, fell into an uneasy silence. Courtiers froze, unsure whether to look away or to stare at the princess whose dignity was stripped in an instant. For a dynasty obsessed with control and ceremony, nothing was more unsettling than such an unpredictable spectacle. Illness did not respect titles. The whispers began immediately. Some saw the episode as a sign of possession, others as divine punishment, while a few quietly wondered if this was yet another reminder of the family's dangerous entanglement of bloodlines. Physicians were summoned, their remedies as elaborate as they were ineffective prayers, powders, and bleeding cups that left Catherine weaker than before. The seizures did not stop with that banquet. They returned, sometimes with months of uneasy calm between them, other times striking without warning. On one occasion, she collapsed during a mass, her cries echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings while priests clutched their crosses in fear. At another gathering, courtiers recalled how she convulsed so violently that attendants had to carry her away. Her jewels scattered across the marble floor like discarded evidence of her fragile body. Each attack deepened the unease. Nobles who once bowed to her began to look at her with a mix of pity and dread. Catherine was not alone in this affliction. The Habsburg dynasty carried a long shadow of hereditary weakness. Her uncle, Emperor Rudolph II, was notorious for bouts of depression, erratic behavior, and possible neurological disorders. Other relatives displayed physical deformities or signs of inherited illness. To the outside world, these were isolated misfortunes. To those within the family, they were unspoken truths. The dynasty that crowned emperors and queens also produced heirs who could barely survive their own bodies. Catherine's seizures were not a private tragedy, but part of a pattern that many recognized yet dared not name aloud. In an age without modern medicine, epilepsy was feared and misunderstood. It was not seen as a condition of the brain, but as a sign of something mystical or cursed. To have a princess convulse in front of her subjects was more than humiliating. It was destabilizing. The dynasty thrived on projecting divine favor. Yet here was a child of Habsburg blood collapsing like a common patient. Each episode gnawed at the image of strength the family tried so desperately to display. Behind the walls of her palace, Catherine's life grew smaller. Guards and attendants kept a closer watch. Her appearances were carefully controlled, and festive occasions became fewer. When she did step into public view, there was always a tension, a fear that another seizure would erupt and shatter the illusion of poise. She lived in a gilded cage, not because of political enemies or hostile nations, but because of her own body's rebellion. Historians now look back and see in her story the marks of a dynasty undermined by its own choices. The Habsburgs believed their policy of intermarriage would keep their line unbreakable. Yet it brought with it the slow accumulation of hidden defects. Catherine's seizures can be read not only as symptoms of epilepsy, but as symbols of a larger collapse already underway. She was not just a young woman caught in the cruelty of her time. She was a reflection of the risks taken by a family that chose purity over health, continuity over vitality. The question lingers even centuries later: was Catherine Renata simply unlucky, born with an illness that medicine could not yet explain? Or was she the inevitable result of generations of blood kept too closely bound in her trembling body? The empire saw both a personal tragedy and a prophecy. What use was a throne that commanded half of Europe if it could not free its heirs from the prison of their own blood? As Catherine Renata entered her final years, the brilliant promise of her youth had dimmed into a life measured by episodes of fear and silence. The court no longer displayed her openly, not because she lacked noble bearing, but because her body could no longer be trusted. What had once been rare, shocking interruptions became a rhythm of her existence. The seizures struck with cruel unpredictability, and the dynasty responded not with compassion, but with retreat. She was gradually withdrawn from public life, tucked away in chambers where the whispers of courtiers could not reach her ears, yet their judgment followed her like a shadow. Medicine in the late 16th century offered no mercy. Physicians treated her with concoctions made of herbs, ground minerals, and sometimes substances as dangerous as they were useless. Some prescribed purges to cleanse her blood, Others burned incense in her chambers in hopes of driving out invisible demons. A few even suggested holy relics be placed near her bed, believing divine power might quiet the storms within her body. None of it worked. Each treatment left her weaker, more exhausted, and more aware of the futility of human knowledge. For a princess raised in an empire that claimed dominion over much of Europe, there was a bitter irony in the fact that her caretakers could not master the simplest enemy, the rebellion of her own body. But her decline was not only medical. In a court obsessed with appearances, Catherine's illness carried stigma as well as suffering. A woman of noble birth was expected to marry strategically, to embody health and virtue, to serve as both ornament and bond between powerful families. Catherine's seizures shattered that expectation. Who would see a bride in the young woman whose lips frothed with foam before horrified onlookers? Who would offer a throne to a girl whose body might collapse at any moment? She was no longer a valuable piece in the grand political chessboard. She became instead a figure avoided, pitied, and quietly erased from dynastic ambition. This knowledge must have weighed on her as heavily as the illness itself. Catherine lived in gilded halls, surrounded by paintings of saints and ancestors, but she must have felt like an exile in her own home. Every corridor reminded her of duties she could never fulfill. Every formal dinner she was too weak to attend reminded her of her absence in the tapestry of her family's power. It was not only her body that betrayed her, but also the court that turned away, unwilling to acknowledge what she represented. The loneliness of her final years is difficult to overstate. Even as servants attended her daily needs, she was isolated from the rhythm of life at court. Friends of her youth married and left for other lands, their lives woven into alliances she would never share. Catherine, by contrast, was left to the echo of prayers, the taste of bitter remedies, and the constant dread of the next seizure. To live inside such grandeur and yet feel so powerless was to experience a peculiar form of imprisonment. The psychological toll deepened her decline. Modern readers may see in her story the signs of depression, of a spirit slowly breaking under the weight of isolation. In her time, however, there were no words to describe this despair. It remained unspoken, visible only in her silences, in the way her presence faded from the chronicles of the court. She was not merely a sick princess. She was a reminder of everything the dynasty feared to admit. The Habsburgs could not protect their own children from the legacy of their choices, and Catherine embodied that truth. In those final years, Catherine Renata lived not as a vibrant daughter of empire, but as a prisoner of fragility, locked within the very body that bore her bloodline. The palace walls may have glittered with wealth, but for her they might as well have been stone bars. Every day reminded her that the grandeur of her family name offered no shield against the quiet cruelty of decline. The night of Catherine Renata's death was remembered not for ceremony, but for terror. In her private chamber, lit only by flickering candles, attendants gathered nervously, for they had long learned to dread the sudden violence of her illness. That evening, the calm broke once more. A low cry escaped her lips before her body convulsed with a force that shook her entire frame. Her arms struck against the bedding, her eyes widened in panic, and foam collected at the corners of her mouth. Servants rushed forward, some holding her down, others whispering frantic prayers, yet all knew they could do nothing to halt what had begun. The seizure lasted longer than usual. Her breathing grew shallow, then burst into gasps as her chest rose and fell unevenly. At times, she appeared to lose consciousness, her body collapsing as though life itself was slipping away, only to be thrown back into violent spasms. the chamber filled with the sound of muffled sobs, for even those accustomed to her suffering had never seen such intensity. When silence finally descended, it was not the silence of recovery, but of death. Catherine Renata, the princess once destined to represent the future of her house, had succumbed at the age of 23. The court reacted with the stillness of denial. There were no grand proclamations, no parades of mourning through the streets. The official cause of death, according to sparse records, was linked to seizures or a disorder of the nervous system, though medicine at the time could not provide more clarity. But the silence that followed invited questions. Why was her death recorded with such brevity, when other royal deaths inspired chronicles and sermons? Why did the court move so quickly to close her chapter, as if her life were an inconvenience best forgotten? Comparisons with other Habsburg tragedies only deepen the mystery. Centuries later, Charles II of Spain would embody the physical collapse of the dynasty. His body and mind weakened beyond repair. Others too had suffered sudden illnesses, deformities, or unexplained deaths. In Catherine's case, the timing and manner of her death were consistent with epilepsy. Yet the secrecy that surrounded it made it difficult to separate fact from speculation. For a family that guarded its image with almost religious fervor, admitting that a princess had died convulsing like a common patient was unthinkable. And so, theories took root. Some whispered that she had been poisoned, perhaps by rivals within or beyond the court, who saw her fragility as a liability. Others suggested she had been quietly neglected, her food or treatments withheld to hasten what was already inevitable. Still others believed she was simply another victim of the dynasty's long experiment in bloodline purity. Her death, the natural result of choices made generations before she was born. Each explanation carried with it a sense of unease, for none could be proven, yet none could be dismissed. What is most haunting is not just how Catherine died, but how little her passing mattered to those who recorded it. She left no marriage alliances, no heirs, no political imprint, only the image of a young woman overcome by forces she could not control. Her end was both deeply personal and disturbingly symbolic. A single seizure extinguished her life, but behind it loomed the shadow of a dynasty struggling against its own silent inheritance. This raises the question that lingers even now. Was Catherine Renata's death the unavoidable conclusion of a natural illness? Or was it deliberately cloaked by a court unwilling to expose its weaknesses? Did she fall simply as a victim of her body? Or was she sacrificed to protect the myth of invincibility that the Habsburgs tried so carefully to preserve? Catherine Renata's death did not echo with the solemnity usually reserved for a daughter of the Habsburgs. There was no spectacle of mourning, no flood of sermons, no proclamation to elevate her memory. Her burial was discreet, conducted with a restraint that seemed intentional. The court, always so careful with symbols, treated her passing as something best concealed rather than commemorated. This silence was louder than any dirge. It revealed not only grief, but calculation. A grand funeral would have drawn attention to the unsettling manner of her death. A lavish memorial would have invited questions the dynasty had no wish to answer. By minimizing ceremony, the court sought to control the narrative. Her name was recorded, but her story was locked away, leaving behind only fragments. In this void, speculation flourished. Poison was one explanation, whispered by those who believed she had become inconvenient. Neglect was another. The idea that her caretakers had simply allowed decline to run its course until her body could endure no more. Others leaned toward inevitability, saying her seizures were not an illness at all, but a living curse. the price of her family's unbroken bloodline. Each rumor told more about the anxieties of the dynasty than about Catherine herself. What is striking is how quickly she faded from collective memory. Royal daughters were usually woven into dynastic marriages or remembered through portraits and chronicles. Catherine left little trace. Few portraits survive, fewer still contemporary writings. The silence that followed her death was not accidental, it was curated. To keep her in memory was to preserve the image of weakness, so her absence became a form of self-preservation for the family's myth. Yet erasure could not extinguish unease. Servants, minor nobles, and travelers carried her story in hushed tones. They spoke of a young woman whose end was too violent, too abrupt, to be accepted as natural. They repeated half-formed tales of palace intrigue, of physicians sworn to secrecy, of a dynasty willing to bury more than a body. These whispers spread further than official proclamations ever could, attaching themselves to the long chain of tragedies that marked the Habsburg name. Catherine Renata became a cautionary ghost, not a martyr, not a heroine, but a symbol of how easily even a princess could be erased when she no longer served the image of power. Her life ended in silence, and her memory was shaped not by chronicles, but by rumor. The quiet around her was not forgetfulness, but intention. Catherine Renata's brief life did not leave treaties, heirs, or monuments, yet her silence became its own form of legacy. To the dynasty that erased her, she was not remembered as a daughter, but as an inconvenience. To history, however, she remains as a symbol of what power dares not speak. In the 16th century, Europe regarded the Habsburgs as near invincible. Their banners stretched across Austria, Spain, the Low Countries, and beyond. Their marriages bound Catholic Europe into a single family tree that seemed unshakable. Yet within the walls of their palaces, the cracks were clear. Catherine's seizures, hushed away by servants and ignored by chroniclers, told a different story than the one carved on coins and painted on canvases. Her death revealed not the strength of empire, but the fragility beating inside its most guarded bloodlines. This is why her disappearance from memory is telling. The Habsburgs understood the power of narrative. They knew that a single story could weaken an image more than any army. By consigning Catherine to obscurity, they tried to erase not just a person, but a truth that their claim to divine favor was haunted by bodies that faltered under the weight of inheritance. In forgetting her, they preserved their myth. Yet the very act of forgetting turned her into a symbol of the silence that history often carries. There is a haunting contrast in her story. Outside her chambers, music and ceremony proclaimed a dynasty chosen by God. Inside, a young woman fought against an unseen force, her struggle witnessed only by frightened attendants. That contrast between spectacle and secrecy, between gold and frailty, captures the paradox of all empires. Power can command obedience, but it cannot command the body. Authority can bend nations, but it cannot rewrite blood. Catherine Renata's name may be faint in the records, yet her death whispers across the centuries. It reminds us that dynasties fall not only by swords or revolutions, but also by the quiet tragedies of their heirs. She stands as a forgotten figure, but also as a warning carved in silence. A throne can stand against enemies outside its walls, but it cannot stand against the rebellion of its own flesh. And if you think Catherine's end was the only story buried in silence, stay with us. Subscribe to The Torture Throne, because there are still many royal ghosts waiting for their names to be spoken.